everyone, welcome to the August 25th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragona, and I'll be joined very shortly by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. This week on the podcast, we're going to take a look back at the stakes racing from last weekend. The focus, obviously, is on Del Mar and Saratoga. At Del Mar, they ran the Grade 1 Pacific Classic, the centerpiece of their summer meet. That was won by last year's 3-year-old champion Maximum Security. We'll talk about him, as well as the other stakes racing from Del Mar on Saturday. They ran a number of graded stakes races, including the Grade 1 Del Mar Oaks, the Grade 2 Del Mar Handicap. We also saw Mo Forza, a good 3-year-old from last year, in action there on Sunday in the Del Mar Mile, and they ran a sprint stakes last week on Friday. So we'll talk about all of those. Saratoga, the focus was on turf racing. They ran their two major Grade 1 turf races of the meet, the 4-Star Dave and the Diana for the fillies and mares. That took place on Sunday between Chad Brown's horses, Rushing Fall and Sister Charlie, both in action there. We'll talk about that, and then we'll finish up at Monmouth Park with the Iselin Stakes. Bit of a controversial DQ in that one, but also some nice horses in action, so we'll get to that at the end of the show. But we'll start at Del Mar, and Craig, we saw some nice performances, especially on Saturday, and Maximum Security did what was expected of him in the Pacific Classic.
He did. He ran a nice race, his second nice one since he came back. He got a 126 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. Was a little surprising, some of the tactics in the race. I really didn't expect them to get such an easy lead without being pushed. I'm not sure yet whether those pace figures will be in blue, but if not, they're going to be pretty close to it. It was certainly a moderate pace, but as for him, he did all that was asked of him, and he's looking pretty sharp this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a bit of a question, or at least there was after the San Diego, about whether he's come back as the same horse since Saudi Arabia, since leaving Jason Service's bar. Now he's with Bob Baffert. After the San Diego, I think you could have made the case that maybe he had to work a little bit harder for that victory than some might have assumed. But this victory was pretty authoritative. It's not like Maximum Security. I mean, when you put aside the races where he was facing claiming horses last year, it's not like Maximum Security's ever been the kind of horse that's going to run away from his competition. He's typically the kind of horse that runs to the horses he's facing. He likes a fight. He'll let horses come to him at the top of the stretch and then kick away from him. That's how he's done it basically over the last year or so in his Grade 1 races. So I wasn't surprised to the manner in which he won this race. Like you said, maybe it looked like there was a little more speed on paper, but we talked about it beforehand. The fact that his main pace rival, Midcourt, was drawn on the rail was going to be a little problematic for that horse because he's never that quick out of the gate. And in this race, Midcourt broke with the field, but if you watch all of his races, he's just so sluggish getting into stride. And that was the case again here. After they took about 10 strides into the race, he was already 2 lengths behind. So I kind of understand why Victor Espinosa didn't try so hard to get him up in there on the inside because he already had a deficit to make up right out of the gate, but it allowed Maximum Security to get a perfect trip up front, and I thought he took a nice step forward and ran the kind of speed figure I would have expected. To me, he looks like pretty much the same horse we've always seen, but I know some people have a different opinion about that.
Yeah, I'm a little concerned. I put it on Twitter. Normally with a horse this late in his 4-year-old season, I would have expected for a horse winning a Grade 1 in particular, better figures than he was running at the beginning of this year or the end of last year. There are some extenuating circumstances, but, I suspect maybe he's not quite the same horse. Well, he's the same horse, but he's not getting the same edge that he was getting with the Service Barn. Time will tell. As we've discussed on Twitter, not all service horses are equal. They didn't all react the same way to whatever he was doing. And some did, some didn't, and maybe he's one that didn't. But I am a little skeptical that he's a horse that's going to suddenly pop a 135 type speed figure, which is what I would have expected just based on races last year.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fascinating thing to discuss because we run into so many of these ex-service horses and you really don't know what you're going to get from them. As you said, we see some that run back to their prior form and some that really don't and they just completely fall apart. I would say Maximum Security, from my vantage point, falls more into the former camp, although obviously there's a spectrum of how these horses run back to their prior performances. I mean, the point I was just making when we were having that discussion last night is just that I don't think you can just automatically subtract X amount of points about how fast a horse would have run just based on the fact that we know they probably were getting some performance-enhancing drugs prior to leaving the service barn. You don't know what the effect of that stuff is going to be, and you even see this in human athletes when you have doping scandals. an athlete could have been a top athlete before taking performance-enhancing drugs, and just because they took them doesn't mean they got so much better. It just means that they were trying to get some type of edge, whether it worked out that way or not. And a lot of these methods that are used are done to mask some sort of pain. And if there was nothing to mask in the first place and they're just giving the same regimen to every horse, as that federal indictment said, maybe it wasn't having that much of effect on horses that didn't need it. And I don't know anything about Maximum Security's case. Obviously, who knows which horses needed what? And I use the word need carefully, because obviously none of these horses needed any of this help, and these are all illegal methods. But I just think it's something that we can't really know, and it's hard to quantify.
Right, and as a figure guy, I'm just looking at the numbers and seeing he's a couple lengths slower, which may or may not mean anything. Just to sidetrack a little, there's a pretty fascinating documentary, I think it's still on Netflix, called Icarus, where a guy actually, he's a cyclist who's not a professional, but a really high-level cyclist. They competed in amateur races, and he actually intentionally started juicing to see what the effects were. And what eventually happens, it leads to the whole Russian doping scandal. But from that individual standpoint, is he was juicing and all the tests showed that he was going to be faster and he had more stamina and everything. But then the very same race that he competed in the year before and did very well, his results were not as good this year. Now, there were extenuating circumstances, but that part gets kind of overlooked in the documentary because of what it led to. But the guy's performance actually regressed. Now, part of it was due to injury, but it was just something that struck me as interesting, that, just because you're juicing and as I said, this guy was doing it intentionally as a study, it doesn't mean the results are going to carry over.
I actually have that documentary on my to-watch list. I had somebody else recommend it to me as well, so I should check it out at some point. And, I mean, it is kind of a shame that we have to even have this kind of discussion about about a horse like Maximum Security, because he obviously is so talented. And I just think there's maybe a little bit of question about whether he really is at the top of the handicap division at this point, because we've seen a number of performances from horses like Improbable and Tom Stay Top, and it remains to be seen how Maximum Security stacks up against those horses. But obviously he deserves the chance based on how he's run this summer. And it should be an interesting fall to see these horses face off, at least in the Breeders' Cup Classic, if that's when we finally get to see them run against each other.
Yeah, and I do want to mention Sharp Samurai ran a very good race to be second. I'm curious what they're going to do with him, because he did have some dirt form earlier in his career, and I thought he ran a pretty good race to be second. He was kind of in that chase position where he's not really the horse that has run all that close up before, so I thought he ran pretty well given the situation.
No, that was a good call by you. You mentioned him as a horse to use underneath, and he completed the exacta. The other Grade 1 race that ran on Saturday at Del Mar was the Del Mar Oaks for the 3-year-old fillies, and this one featured a bit of an upset as 19-1 Red Lark got the job done over 27-1 California Kook. The big favorite Laura's Light was just kind of a no-show. She set what should have been a moderate pace for her. She just didn't see out the distance at all, and it opened up the door for some long shots.
Yeah, it was quite the interesting development, given Parkour was in here, a horse who had run off the last two times, setting really fast fractions with big leads before, one time actually hanging on, just running the field off her feet in their allowance race, and then in the honeymoon trying the same thing. But she looked like a different horse this time as she rated comfortably behind the slow pace, but still had nothing left for the finish. Laura's Light was out there all by herself and did little running, and once the two Europeans didn't really show up that we talked about on the forecast, and Miss Extra and Nage Blanche, it left the race kind of wide open, and that's the kind of results you're going to get when the favorites don't show up.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a whole lot to say about this field. It got a very slow speed figure for a Grade 1 race. I believe the figure you said is 109. I thought Red Lark was a little interesting in a race we handicapped with Laura's Light going all the way back to the springtime. I think it was the honeymoon. She was a big price that day and couldn't quite get it done. The tables were turned here. Obviously, Laura's Light didn't show up with her A effort here. I mentioned last week when we recapped the Saratoga Oaks, which was a $500,000 listed stakes race, that it was kind of a shame that some of the top 3-year-old fillies didn't show up there. Well, they weren't here in this Grade 1 race either. I don't think we'll see any of these horses getting Grade 1 victories again in the future, but I guess you never know.
Yeah, Red Lark is the kind of horse I actually would normally like. She had been having trouble with races that had blue fractions the last couple out, closing into them, but she was still a little light on the speed figure scale. For me, I wasn't able to come up with her. And as you say, it's just a pretty weak grade 1 given the figure that she got from me, and not a whole lot more to say about this one.
Well, the Del Mar Oaks was won by Red Lark, and the Del Mar Handicap was won by Red King, also in an upset, though not quite to the same magnitude. I thought this was a pretty enterprising ride from Umberto Rispoli on Red King, who really went out of his way to get the jump on United, and it did make the difference at the end.
Yeah, I mean, when you look back, a lot of times riders that make that early move get criticized, but it seems like he actually had a plan, and it worked. He knew who the horse to beat was in United. There wasn't a whole lot of doubt about that going on, and he executed his plan to perfection. He kind of got the jump while United was bottled up. We already knew this horse could run all day, as he had come out of winning the San Juan Capistrano easily at 1 3/4 miles. So on this turnback, once he got the jump, he was always going to be tough to run down.
Yeah, as you said, it looked like that was the plan, and they knew he had the stamina, so they probably thought we could start moving at about the half mile, maybe 7/16 pole, and get the jump on United and just keep going. And we know one thing we know about United is that he doesn't have the most effective turn of foot. He's just sort of a grinder, and if you give him enough ground to make up from the top of the stretch to home, he's just not going to get there. And I think that's what they were gambling on with Red King, and credit to the horse, because they made that early move. And Umberto Rispoli, once he got to the front at about the 3/8 pole, he eased up on him a little bit, let him coast around the turn, and then asked him to kick on again at the quarter pole. And this horse really responded and did so. So obviously he's taken a big step forward recently for Phil D'Amato, a horse who really struggled to break through his N1X condition for a long time until he was a 6-year-old. But now he's got 2 graded stakes victories in a row. It just seems like he's really turned a corner late in his career.
Yeah, and I should mention he got a 122 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. So again, it's okay, I guess, for grade 2 types, but California division is just a little bit weaker on the grass in my opinion, and I'd be skeptical. I know United ran well in the Breeders' Cup last year at 1.5 miles, and maybe that's what he really wants. He doesn't get a whole lot of chances to run that out west, so he's been running some shorter distances, but otherwise, outside the top 2, there wasn't a whole lot in here, just a bunch of horses that take turns beating each other.
Staying on the turf on Sunday at Del Mar, they ran the Del Mar Mile, and not the strongest field from top to bottom, but obviously there was a star in the midst in Mo Forza, who won a couple of Grade 1 races for the 3-year-olds last year. Disappointed in the Pegasus World Cup turf earlier this year, though. I think if you watch that race back, he had a pretty taxing trip going wide around both turns that day. This was his first start since then, and he did exactly what you'd want to see in his return race, beating inferior horses like they were inferior horses.
Yeah, this was a good effort. I don't have an official speed figure on him yet. I would venture a guess that it's going to be about 124 or 125. And that's the kind of step forward you want to see for a 4-year-old. We hadn't seen him since the Pegasus, as you mentioned. He put together a nice string of wins last year. I think, if my memory serves, he even wound up 2nd or 3rd in the Eclipse voting for best turf horse, and this is the kind of race you want to see. A horse winning a turf race by 4 or 5 lengths is really the equivalent of doing it by 6 or 7 on the dirt. So really strong effort in his return, and he is one of the more exciting prospects on grass that we're going to have out west.
Yeah, we're going to talk about another 1-mile turf race later in the show that was run on the East Coast. But Mo Forza looks like the kind of horse that could step up to Grade 1 company pretty soon, once again, based on this performance, because he just decimated this field. I really liked the acceleration he showed at the end of the race, because he didn't get out of the gate that well, and maybe wasn't as forwardly placed as some people might have thought, given the stalking up-close trips he had gotten in his successful races last year. But he really showed a nice turn of foot through the stretch of this race, and I just thought this was an excellent return, and he's likely on to bigger and better things after this. For the sprinters on Saturday, they ran the Grade 3 Green Flash, going 5 furlongs on the turf course, and a horse that we know from the Mid-Atlantic circuit, Chaos Theory, was making his first start off the claim for John Sadler of Ronas Racing, and basically we saw more of the same from him. he maybe improved slightly in this race, but he's always been a really nice horse. It's just that his prior connections had some trouble keeping him on the racetrack. We'll see if these current connections can have him string together some races, but he's clearly pretty good.
Yeah, he got a 117 Timeform US speed figure for the win. Nothing I'm going to get too excited about, but it was good enough to win this race. He got a decent enough trip. 5.5 furlong seems to be just what he likes, and I think him able to ship in. It's not so much that he improved here. It was just not the strongest of races that we're going to see for even a grade 3 turf sprint. Is pretty much, one of the better races you're going to see. We don't have a lot of graded turf sprints out there. So for me, it was a disappointing race from a depth standpoint, but he did the job and did what he had to do.
I would say he's probably the fastest son of Curlin out there. It's kind of funny. We were so used to Curlin getting route horses or horses that don't have a lot of speed, and he's just a 5 furlong turf sprinter. I don't think too many of the Curlin's progeny do that. On Friday, we saw a dirt sprint for the fillies and mares, the Rancho Bernardo. That was won by Sneaking Out, who's just a really admirable filly, loves to win races for Jerry Hollendorfer. She had a bit of a lull over the past year or so, but it seems like recently she's gotten back into the top form that we were accustomed to seeing out of her back when she was an early season 3-year-old. She was coming off performance where she upset Bellafina, and Bellafina certainly came back out of that race to do well in the Ballerina, and Seeking Out just kind of validated that she maybe is an improved horse now.
Yeah, she is. She ran the same 114 Timeform US that she had run when she beat Bellafina. Solid effort. She won easy. We do have the pace coded a little in blue, but it's not like she said won the race wire to wire. She was able to rake comfortably off of them. So I'm not really sure what to do with this one just yet. I'd like to see a little more of a breakout performance from a speed figure perspective, and maybe that'll be coming soon. But as far as being a horse, I guess we're getting fairly close to the Breeders' Cup. We're getting to the point where a lot of these horses may not run again before the Breeders' Cup. So if she were to show up there, I wouldn't be interested in her. But maybe if she ran again and had that breakout number.
Now, we're going to get to a few 2-year-olds at Saratoga in a little bit that were impressive last week, but one that turned a lot of heads in California was the first race on Saturday where Princess Noor for Bob Baffert just easily defeated a field of maidens, including a highly regarded stablemate. And she did it very impressively, basically under wraps the entire way with Victor Espinoza. This daughter of Not This Time obviously has a ton of talent. I didn't see the speed figure, Craig. Do you know how fast this race was?
Yeah, it came up just an 82. It was an 87 on final time, but the pace was particularly slow early, so she was docked a little bit for that. But that said, I don't think the speed figure means a whole lot in this case. We saw that last year with a horse like Gamine. She did it so easily. She's clearly a talented filly, and the next time she runs, if challenged, I would expect a much bigger number.
Yeah, as you said, she didn't go that fast up front. Really, nobody challenged her in the early going. I did think it was impressive the way that she quickened at the end of the race. Sometimes you don't see these dirt horses really make multiple moves within a race and finish faster than they started. So it was nice to see her really kick home because the runner-up was coming after her at the end, that Flash Magic, Bob Baffert's other first-time starter, and she put some distance between herself and the rest of the field. So I think both of these horses have talent. I should mention Flash Magic is a half-sister to the Breeders' Cup Juvenile winner, Good Magic from a few years ago for the same connections. So it'll be interesting to see how both of these horses progress, but obviously the winner looks like she has a ton of talent. Moving east to Saratoga, foreshadowed it a little bit before when we were talking about Mo Forza, but they ran the Grade 1 4-star Dave on Saturday, and I've got to be honest, a little surprising to see Chad Brown out of the Superfecta here. We talked about beforehand how he basically had this race covered from top to bottom. What looked like they would be the top 3 choices in the wagering in Uni, Raging Bull, and Without Parole. They all were out of the money. They all were out of the Superfecta. And the race was just dominated on the front end by Halliday. And I've got to say, watching this race, after that first quarter went up in 23-4, it was just over. Because I know they had taken races off the turf on Saturday, but if you've been watching the entire week at Saratoga, you knew the turf course was pretty firm anyway, even after that rain. And they just weren't catching Halliday after letting him get away with that opening quarter.
Yeah, it was a very nice call by you on the forecast. As I commented on Twitter, I'm usually more the speed guy, but you were all over this one where I kind of kind of dismissed him, but I don't think there's any doubting it's a strong effort, and Halliday is now a serious racehorse that you got to consider when in these graded stakes races. He did have a nice trip, but he does have that tactical speed that's going to make it possible. I would imagine he's going to have a harder time getting away with these with an easy lead like that next time out. But really strong effort. He got a 127 Timeform US speed figure for the win. I was impressed to see Got Stormy, who seemingly just runs and runs and runs, and it seemed to have gone off form quite a bit this year, particularly in her last couple races. But maybe she just loves Saratoga, but whatever it was, she looked like her old self running a good second in here. And the disappointing horse, I would say, had to have been Uni. She just didn't do a whole lot of running. You could use the excuse of the pace that she had, but it could just be a case of she's a very good horse, but she needs a really fast pace to win, because most of her wins last year came in races like that. I think she even had a rabbit, if I remember, for some of those wins, and it looks like she's either lost a step or just needs a perfect setup.
Yeah, I thought it was nice to see Got Stormy get back to one of her better races. She probably benefited from getting a nice trip right behind Halliday on the rail the entire way. And I do think it's worth mentioning that, especially after that rain early on Saturday, it does seem like the rail, right down on the hedge, since they've taken the rails down over the past week, that being down there is a benefit to the horses that ride that path the entire way. Obviously, Halliday was one of them. Got Stormy rode the rail. Even Casa Creed, who was third in this race, was on the rail for both turns and then angled out in the stretch to make his late run. And it's also worth noting that Chad Brown's runners, few of them were on the rail at any point in this race, so maybe that compromised them a little bit. I wouldn't say that was the only excuse they had. The other excuse, obviously, was the pace of this race, just kind of breaking it apart. Halliday won his opening quarter in 23-4, got to the half in 47, and then came home the second half mile in 46-1. There's just no way you're going to catch a horse like Halliday when he runs his second half mile a full second faster than his first half mile. And when you let a horse do that, which we saw him get that same kind of setup in a few races at Gulfstream, he's just impossible to catch. But the other thing about Halliday, and kind of the reason I liked him going into this race, is even though horses like Raging Bull and Without Parole had been competing at the Grade 1 level, it's not like they had been running speed figures that suggested they were superior to a horse like Halliday, who had been running the same speed figures in listed stakes races. Sometimes class matters a lot, but sometimes the speed figures don't lie. And in this case, Halliday was every bit as good as the classier horses in the field.
Yeah, I was going to say, from a speed figure perspective, him and Uni were the two best horses in the field, and he clearly had the tactical edge. So in retrospect, 5-1 were pretty good odds.
Now on Sunday, we saw another Grade 1 race on the turf, this one for the fillies and mares, and this was a really exciting one to watch because you had two fillies just at the top of their game in Rushing Fall and Mean Mary. They both have tactical speed. Thought it was a little bit risky for Javier Castellano to sort of let Mean Mary go on with it in the early going and allow her to set a comfortable pace for her, but Javier was comfortable with the horse that he had underneath him in Rushing Fall, and these two just threw it down over the final quarter mile, and Chad Brown in Rushing Fall prevailed in the Diana. Another win for Chad Brown. I think this was his fifth or sixth Diana, the sixth Grade 1 for Rushing Fall. She's just a really cool mare.
Yeah, she is. This was one of my favorite races of the year already. I mean, it was just two mares throwing it down. Well, one's a filly and Mean Mary, but just going at it for the last probably 3 furlongs. And neither one of them really relented. Rushing Fall just had a little more quickness at the finish and proved that she is just really something special. I mean, when you look at her overall record, she's almost, I would say, got Hall of Fame credentials, and I don't think she's finished yet. So she is quite a good one. We've talked about Mean Mary on this show. This may have even been a little short for her. I would imagine it was just a spot that fit her schedule, and who wants to pass up a shot at a Grade 1 with a hot horse like her. But she lost nothing in defeat. She's one that, as she gets back out to longer distances, is just going to be very, very tough to beat because of that speed she has and how tough she is in the lane. She still finishes off her races. I should say Rushing Fall got a 126 for the win, and I'm curious what they're going to do with her. I did hear some people like on the Fox show, they were talking about they thought maybe a mile and an eighth would be pushing it for her. And even before the race, I just don't see it. She's always been very good at a mile and an eighth, if you ask me. The one time I think she lost was in the Diana to Sister Charlie, where arguably I'd say she ran one of her better races. So just a really cool mare, and looking forward to seeing how she finishes out the year.
I've got to say, I'm on the same page with you about Rushing Fall and these so-called distance limitations. I know that in that Diana last year, much was made of the fact that she lost that race to Sister Charlie, but remember, they put the rabbit Thais in there to help Sister Charlie, and in helping Sister Charlie in that Diana, they might have actually hurt Rushing Fall a little bit, because she's the horse that would have wanted to be closer to the pace, and she ended up having to make the first move after that pace setter when Sister Charlie got her at the end. But in a race like this, where Sister Charlie's not getting that help from a rabbit, I mean, we'll talk about her in a little bit. She's obviously tailed off, but Rushing Fall's able to get the kind of trip that she wants, and she's just so good. As you said, I mean, at this point, her resume is almost every bit as good as the resume that Sister Charlie's put together. Obviously, Rushing Fall has that Breeders' Cup win as a 2-year-old. She hasn't done it as an older horse yet, but I like the way she's coming. She's come back this year as a 5-year-old, and it's going to be interesting to see which Breeders' Cup race they choose for her, because there is this thought that maybe she's best at a mile, so perhaps they could run her in the Breeders' Cup mile. Chad Brown obviously still has Uni for that race if it turns out that she's as good this year as she's been in past years. But I wouldn't be so deterred from trying Rushing Fall in the Breeders' Cup Filly and Mare Turf. You'll have to remind me how far it is at the venue they're running it this year. But if it's 1.25 miles, I think that is a distance that she can certainly handle.
Yeah, I was going to ask you the same thing. I don't know what it is at Keeneland. I'm not familiar if they run them. I don't remember off the top of my head if they run 1.25 miles on the turf. So that's something we'll have to look up and maybe mention it before the forecast starts next time. Because I'm with you. I would try her at 1.25 miles. I think the Wooders will be a bit tougher if she turned back to 1 mile, where she'd have to face colts, some really good shippers from overseas. But 1.3 miles, even I would admit that might be pushing it for her. So I'll just have to check it out and see what the distance is. I do know they run 1 mile and a 3/16, so even that's possible there.
I just looked it up. When they ran the Breeders' Cup at Keeneland in 2015, and Stephanie's Kitten won it for Chad Brown, it was 1 mile and 3/16 race. So if the Breeders' Cup Filly Mare Turf is 1 mile and 3/16 this year, I would say that's the race for Rushing Fall, and I would love to see her and Mean Mary going that distance by the time Mean Mary has reached her full maturity in the fall, because I don't want to shortchange Mean Mary, and you weren't either. She ran a really nice race here, and she's just taken a step forward with every start since the beginning of the year for Graham Motion. It's kind of unfortunate that Graham Motion just can't seem to beat Chad Brown in the Diana. I think this was his 6th second-place finish in the Diana, but Mean Mary is obviously a top-class racehorse.
Yeah, she's one of my favorite horses in training right now. I love the horses that just go and make you come get them.
Yeah, we didn't really mention it, but obviously Sister Charlie didn't show up once again in this race. She accomplished some awesome things over the past couple of seasons, and the pace was not in her favor in this race. It just seems like she lacks that late punch that she once possessed, and I don't know if we're going to see her again, but if we don't, she certainly had a fantastic career.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I would imagine she is definitely a Hall of Fame horse. As I mentioned, Rushing Fall is possible. I think she's a lock for that and has given us a lot of thrills. And if she just doesn't have it have that same kick left there, she's lost nothing in defeat for me.
Now, the other races we'll talk about from Saratoga this past week were all for the 2-year-olds. A couple of stakes races on the turf. The one for the fillies, the Bolton Landing, was won by Toby's Heart. And this is a filly that has quite a bit of ability. If you watched her debut at Churchill Downs from early June, she ran just a remarkable race. She got left at the start, made this prolonged run from the back of the pack to reach contention at the quarter pole, and then just kept on going, ran away from that field. The time came back so fast that I know a lot of speed figure makers didn't even want to put a figure on the race because it seemed like it was unbelievably fast for an early season 2-year-old race. But she came back here and maybe didn't run the same time that she had run in her debut, but did it in a pretty impressive fashion because the pace was not helping her in this race.
No, she ran very well in here. She wound up with a 95 Timeform US speed figure for the effort, and certainly looks like one to watch going forward. I do want to comment a little on that last race. It was just an impossible circumstances to make a speed figure. It was a day at Churchill where there was only that turf sprint early on the card. Some rain came. The turf course changed immensely before any other turf races were run. I'm pretty sure off the top of my head that race was all first-time starters, so I didn't have a single past performance to go by. So any number I would have made up for that race would have just been a complete guess, or you could even say fabrication, because we really had nothing to go on. So it's just one of those unfortunate cases where it was impossible to make a number, and I'd rather have the dash than make something up.
No, that's completely fair. You can't make a projection in a race where you just don't have the data to lead you to any conclusion you have confidence in. But certainly Toby's heart was impressive that day. And it's kind of funny. I mean, for an early season turf sprint, it seems like there was some talent in that field, because even one of the also-rans who Toby's heart just decimated came back and finished right behind the runner-up in this race, Joyce Rocket, in a stakes race at Woodbine next time. So that was a quality field. And not to shortchange the horse who was second in this Bolton Landing, Joyce Rocket, she's got talent as well. Obviously, she was with the pace, whereas Toby's heart wasn't. But she really stepped forward on the turf, and she's now run well on every single surface, winning her debut on the dirt, then her second start on synth, and now just barely missing on the turf. She's pretty cool, but Toby's heart is a very talented 2-year-old filly.
Yeah, and you mentioned the pace a few times. I did want to say we had a couple of the fractions coded in blue, and she came from near the back of the pack. I think she was next to last most of the way until making that impressive kick. So definitely what you want to see. And I'm curious what you think about her going longer. Or is she just a sprinter, or does she one you think could maybe handle 2 turns?
It's kind of hard to say. She has a pretty obscure pedigree. She's by Jack Milton. Obviously, he's a son of Warfront, and he was a turf miler during his career. We don't really know a whole lot about him yet as a sire. And on the dam side, I mean, you could really go a few different ways. Her dam sire is Lil's Lad, who I don't know much about him as a sire at all. He was obviously a very fast and talented racehorse. There's obviously speed and stamina in this pedigree. The most notable horse in her female family is a horse named Great Attack, who was a good turf sprinter for Wesley Ward a number of years ago. He had a ton of longevity. I think Wesley Ward ran him until he was like 7 years old or something, but mostly focusing in turf sprints. So we'll see, but obviously sprinting on the turf, she's already shown that she can do that pretty well, so maybe they won't mess with that too much. And staying with the turf sprinters, we saw the Colts in action in the Skidmore 2 days later. And this performance, while Toby's heart was pretty impressive coming from off the pace, there's nothing like seeing a 2-year-old just flaunt pure speed. And that's what we saw from Golden Pal, who was actually breaking his maiden in this Skidmore. He had been second at Royal Ascot in his prior start in a prestigious race over there. But this was his first victory, and he certainly did it the right way.
He did. He backed up that form that we saw overseas. He won easily to the surprise of no one. I think he went off 2-5 that day. And frankly, watching the race, I expected a much bigger figure. And don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking him at one bit. He still ran a very good 103. But the visual was just so impressive. I almost expected like a 110 type number from him. But he did it easily, and obviously a really talented horse. I think he's probably the favorite for the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Turf Sprint right now.
No, what makes him so dangerous is not only does he have that finishing speed, but he is a rocket ship out of the gate. If you watch the start of this race, one stride out of the gate, he's got a length on the entire field. And that's what you want to see from these turf sprinters, because especially once they get into potentially a 14-horse field in the Breeders' Cup Turf Sprint, you want to have some gate speed to stay out of trouble. And Golden Pal certainly has that. And as you said, I mean, maybe the speed figure seems a little disappointing coming back just to 103, but it's hard to run a really fast speed figure in some of these turf sprints, especially when the turf is really hard and there's not a whole lot of variance in the times. Also, when you don't go that fast on the front end, and not that he was, I mean, people will see the fractions of 21-4 and 44-1 and say, what are you talking about? That wasn't a slow pace. Relative to the final time he ran, it was not a fast pace because he basically came home just as fast as he started. So you want to see that versatility from a turf sprinter, but it seems like he has all the tools to keep going and dominate the other 2-year-olds out there coming into the fall. We'll stay on the turf to discuss one more 2-year-old race from Saratoga this past week. It was actually a maiden race on Sunday, and Craig, I'll admit I did not see the speed figure before sending this race in. Just from a visual standpoint, I thought that the winner, Cal D, was pretty impressive. She got to set a moderate to slow pace on the front end in what was her turf debut. She only had one prior start, running pretty poorly in a dirt sprint. She obviously is a turf horse, though, because once they turned into the lane, she just ran away from this field. I don't know what was behind her, but she was just gobbling up the turf course.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the speed figure. I did a whole bunch of work. I caught up through all the figures through Sunday and forgot to upload them until this morning. So they won't show up in the charts until sometime later today. But it was definitely an impressive effort for a 2-year-old. She actually is going to get a 98 TimeformUS speed figure. She did set kind of a moderate pace, not so slow that any of the fractions will be in blue. It was more an even race where she was finishing off a little bit faster from a figure perspective than what her pace figures showed. But just the way she did it, I mean, it was super impressive. Looking at the fractions as well shows you it was kind of a slow race with a 25 and a 49, but still, for me, that's what I want to see in a turf horse. I want to see him really able to finish off the race, kind of like a horse like Halliday, who we've talked about earlier. When he's able to set that lead and be comfortable, he can still finish off the race. So while, I mean, I do like speed on turf just like I do on dirt, but you got to have that finishing kick, and Caldy certainly showed it.
Yeah, I was impressed with this, and I didn't see the turf pedigree that was so obvious that was going to move her up, just from a handicapping standpoint before this race. But, I mean, she's a daughter of More Than Ready. Her dam was a decent enough turf horse, so it's not a big surprise that she loved the turf course. And she was impressive. The one caveat is what I was noting in the 4-star Dave when we talked about that. The rail on both turf courses might be an advantage, and she was on the inside setting the pace the entire way, just like Halliday was. So I would view this performance maybe with a little bit of skepticism in that sense, but obviously she's got talent, and we'll see what kind of setup she gets in future races. But she certainly deserves to move up to stake company off this performance.
Yeah, and it's good that you note about the rail, because there were definitely plenty of turf races this weekend, and it would be behoove people to spend some time watching some replays and really tracking how these horses do coming back off those efforts, both the ones that were on the rail and the ones that were not.
We'll finish things up this week, staying on the East Coast, but going down to New Jersey at Monmouth Park, where the feature race this past weekend was the Grade 3 Iselin. And the favorite in this race was Warrior's Charge, who was coming off a 4th place finish, a pretty close 4th place finish in the Met Mile behind Vekoma. I would say he regressed a little bit in this race. He was obviously awarded the victory. We can talk about the disqualification a little bit. Pirate's Punch crossed the wire first. Obviously, there was an incident in Deep Stretch where he came over on Warrior's Charge, and maybe there was a little bit of acting going on, but the stewards thought there was enough reason to take action here.
Yeah, I don't know. I saw a lot of talk about this one. I didn't watch it live. I obviously went and watched the replay a couple times, and personally, I wouldn't have DQ'd the winner, but I guess I can see why they can. I don't think it was an egregious call as some people do, but you know, again, I would have sided with leaving him up. There was no reason really for Pirate's Punch to drift in as far as he did. I think he was going to win the race regardless, but you know, it's one of those things you just have to deal with as a bettor. We're going to get decisions we agree with and some we don't. I know how frustrating it can be. I've been on both sides of it, of course, as we all have. From a speed figure perspective, Pirate's Punch got a 122 for his win, and I'm using air quotes there. Warrior's Charge got a 118. Bow Harbor, who was back in third, or Warrior's Charge got a 120. Bow Harbor, who was back in third, got the 118 that he seems to run every single race like clockwork. He's the kind of horse I love as a figure maker because I can almost always base my figures around him. But you know, I'm not sure. I'm curious to hear what you think about the call. Like I said, I'd let it stand, but I can see why the change was made.
Yeah, this is not one that I had a big problem with. I saw some people were just outraged about this decision, as it seems like they are with every steward's decision, whether it makes sense or not. I will say my sense of this is that if you had reversed the riders, on the top two finishers, I don't think people would have been as upset about this call because usually it's Paco Lopez who's pulling that move that Jorge Vargas did in deep stretch here, trying to come over on another horse. And Paco Lopez, who was riding Warrior's Charge, who was put up, did just stand up in the irons. And when you watch the head on, maybe he didn't quite have to be that dramatic about it because there was a little bit of space there, even though it did seem like Warrior's Charge was getting pushed into the rail late. And also, Paco Lopez was trying to angle his horse out into Pirate's Punch, seemingly to really meet that horse and maybe push him out a little bit, because that is how Paco Lopez rides. He's an aggressive rider in his own right. And I don't think you can fault the rider of a horse who's about to be fouled for trying to hold his ground, because so often, especially in New York, when it seems like herding is allowed in races, it's just assumed that the rider of the horse who's herded is just going to allow somebody to move him out to the center of the track or move him down to the rail and not offer any resistance. And obviously Paco Lopez was not about to let that happen. So I kind of understand what was going on there with Paco Lopez trying to angle his horse out into Pirate's Punch. Obviously it didn't work out, and you could make the argument that maybe Warrior's Charge was never coming back to win that race. Watching it, it looked like Pirate's Punch was getting tired on the front end, so I don't know if I would quite buy that argument that Warrior's Charge was never winning under any circumstances. It was not a clear-cut decision in my view. I could see it going either way. I just don't have a strong feeling about it.
Yeah, we're similar there. I will point out Pirate's Punch. He was a horse who was pretty much beaten easily by Tom's D'Etat and that Stephen Foster, and it just shows what a strong race it was. He was seventh, beaten 11 lengths. If you look at his form this year, I think he's a horse who's hit the money every single time. He's won a few races throughout, and to just come back from that seemingly poor effort, even though it looked decent from a speed figure perspective, just shows how strong that Foster was, at least for the top couple. Especially Tom's D'Etat, of course.
Yeah, the one other point I want to make about this race is Warrior's Charge was coming off a career best performance in the Met Mile last time, and I think there was a little bit of question about how much the moderate pace of the Met Mile helped horses like Vekoma and Warrior's Charge, and it's going to be interesting to see what we get from Vekoma when he finally comes back, because he did get a very favorable trip in winning that Met Mile, and obviously he's had a setback, and I didn't see the latest news about whether or not he's missing the Forgo or training up to a race in the fall. But it'll be interesting to see how he comes back off that performance, where he's obviously a very talented horse, but Warrior's Charge, who finished just 2 lengths behind him with a similar trip, didn't quite run back to that effort, so we'll see if Vekoma can as well.
Yeah, and I would say the Met Mile wasn't the strongest race from a speed figure perspective. Vekoma only ran a 124 winning that day. I think we've had 3 or 4 horses run back, and none of them have done anything to invalidate that figure. They've all run basically the same figure. None of them have won, I don't believe, except for Warrior's Charge, again with the air quotes. So, maybe that Met Mile is just not quite as strong as we've seen in some other years.
No, that's a totally fair point. It was an exciting race to watch, and it really got your blood pumping, but it was not the fastest race on the clock. Well, that's all the racing to recap for this week. We do plan on doing our TimeformUS forecast later in the week, and Craig, we haven't talked about it yet, but I assume we'll have a lot to cover at Saratoga. They've got 4 major graded stakes races happening this weekend: the Sword Dancer, the Saranac, the aforementioned Forgo, the Grade 1 event, and the Amsterdam for the 3-year-old sprinters. So a lot going on there. We'll see how they card those races, if they're in some sort of pick 4, pick 5 sequence. But I think we'll do some handicapping and talk about that card when we record the TimeformUS forecast on Friday. Remember, you can always listen to us, both of these podcasts, on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, everybody, and we'll be back with the TimeformUS forecast on Friday.